And with that, David R. Montgomery is a professor at the University of Washington, a MacArthur Fellow, finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award, and an internationally recognized authority on geomorphology. His current research includes field projects in eastern Tibet and the Pacific Northwest of North America, at least that's what the internet tells me. And his books, I should skip that part because it's coming up in a moment. Let's see. Perhaps my favorite of David's credentials, I should just say from jump, is a pet rock petting zoo that he created during his tenure as a scholar in residence here at Town Hall back in what I think was 2015. I hope that was a knowing chuckle from somebody who actually attended the Pet Rock Petting Zoo. Meanwhile, Anne Biklé is a biologist and environmental planner whose writing has appeared in Nautilus, Natural History, Smithsonian, Fine Gardening, and Best Health. Not to break news or anything, but Anna lives and writes here in Seattle with her husband, a fellow called David R. Montgomery. Their books together, this is the part I skipped before, include 2008's Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health from 2015. And they comprise what I've recently learned folks call their Dirt Trilogy. Those books have been translated into 10 different languages. And they're here tonight to discuss their latest work, What Your Food Ate, How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. Please join me in welcoming David R. Montgomery and Anne Biklé.
Great. Well, I'm Dave. Thank you for coming tonight. The way this is going to work is I'm going to be talking for the first half of our talk, and then I'm going to turn it over to my wife, who will talk about the second half of the talk. The choice of which halves we'll each talk about is completely arbitrary. We worked very closely on What Your Food Ate to try and look at really synthesizing a lot of the material that we talked about in our previous books, but adding the dimension of human health to it. So, Dirt was a book that looked back at the erosion of civilizations and how societies throughout history did not prosper when they did not take care of their land. The Hidden Half of Nature looked at sort of why that worked in terms of the role of microbial life, bacteria and fungi in the soil, soil life in promoting soil fertility and building partnerships with plants. And Growing Revolution looked at how that would translate into farming practices worldwide. But the new book, What Your Food Ate, is really taking that material a step further to look at what it may mean for our own health, for human health. And in that sense, what we're looking at is we've tried to step back and look at how soil health, the circle up at the top, influences how the way we farm influences soil health, and how soil health in turn affects the health of our crops, plant health, how that in turn affects the health of our livestock, animal health, and how that may translate into influences on human health. So what we're going to do tonight is give you a little bit of an introduction to the kind of stuff that we go through in the book and the connections. Because if you're trying to look at connecting soil health to human health, there's a lot in between. There's a lot going on. There's our genes, there's whether we get any exercise, there's what we eat. But we'd like to add to that list in terms of how we raise what we eat, what our food ate. So in any case, the big point that we're trying to make is that, in effect, soil health is our health. That how we treat the land, in turn, affects how the land will treat us, not just in terms of the long-term evolution of our societies, but in terms of what's in our food and what that actually may do in terms of supporting our health or not. So I'm going to do the first two halves. I'm going to talk about the influences of farming practices on soil health and what that means for plant and crop health. And then Anne is going to take it for the second half in terms of looking at animal health and human health. So in getting into the soil, when we look today around the world, it's not very controversial, but not very well known that a lot of our agricultural land could be classified as sick. If we think about soil as having health, and most of us probably don't most of the time, it's a very legitimate point to make. The UN's map of global soil degradation that's up on the screen now really makes the point, except that it just disappeared. And so we're going to try and call that back. All right, hopefully it will stay put this time. So the UN's global map of soil degradation, which is shown up there, is essentially a fairly sobering look at the world. You notice that most of the world's agricultural soils are listed as degraded or very degraded. The UN assessments assess that something like a third of the world's farmland soils have been degraded to the point where it's greatly impacting their agricultural productivity so far. Lots of the world's soil has been degraded to the point where it's fair to consider it not healthy. Now, how does that work? Well, in part because of two fundamental practices that we rely on in conventional agriculture and that have long been relied on in the first one, tillage and the use of chemical fertilizers. Tillage, of course, has deep roots in history. Chemical fertilizers, of course, are much more recent in terms of their development and application. But there's sound science that looks at how both those practices, tillage and the overuse of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, can degrade soil organic matter, the life in the soil and the carbon in the soil, in ways that alters communities of soil life in ways that are detrimental to the health and fertility of the land. And again, that's not terribly controversial, but it's not terribly well known. But we rely on those practices to harvest much other food that we grow today in conventional agriculture. And again, another UN report from 2015 projected that we're losing about 0.3% of our ability to produce food each and every year due to degradation of the soil, to the reduction in soil health in that parlance. Mostly due to soil erosion and degradation of soil organic matter, of the fertility, degradation of the fertility of the land. Now that 0.3% doesn't sound like a really big number in any one year, right? That's not a large number on an annual basis. But if you play that out over the rest of this century, it adds up to degrading another third of the world's farmland, something that we can't afford to do as our population continues to rise. This is why some people like Anne and myself, I'm a geologist, she's a biologist, why we would be worried about the health and state of the world's agricultural soils. Now, to put that in perspective a little bit, there was a study in 2015 from the journal Sustainability that looked at the degradation of organic matter, SOM, soil organic matter, in North American cropland soils that found that we degraded about half of the organic matter that we had in our farmland soils at the time that they were first farmed. And if we think of organic matter as essentially the lifeblood of the soil, as essential to soil fertility, we've kind of burned down the batteries of about half of our ability to grow food, or half the fertility of our land, in just a few centuries in North America. And if we look around the world, that 50% value is about right for the global loss of soil organic matter on agricultural lands. What does that look like in terms of the soil itself? The soil up there on the left is a soil from a forest in North Carolina that's literally right over the fence from the soil on the right, which is from a conventionally farmed tobacco plantation that's had about 100, 150 years of conventional farming at this point. The soils are developed on the same parent material, the same underlying substrate. They're developed in the same climate. The only difference is how people have treated the land for about a century. And you'll notice that there's a pretty big difference in the color. That khaki one is missing its organic matter. The life has literally been drained out of it. That's basically the major story in terms of agricultural land degradation around the world in terms of degrading soil fertility. It's been repeated in setting after setting after setting all around the world. Many of the world's agricultural soils, in other words, are sick if we apply the concept of health to them. They're not healthy in terms of being able to support the biological productivity that they did under their native condition. That, of course, brings up the question of, is soil restoration possible? If we know that farming practices have been implicated in degrading soil health, well, what could be done in terms of farming practices and reforming or revising them that could turn that around and reverse the degradation? Is there a possibility of doing that? And that's the point where I think there's really grounds for optimism in terms of looking at the way that we care for the world's soils. Because practices sort of collectively loosely known as regenerative agriculture can rebuild soil organic matter, can rebuild the health and fertility of the land in actually shockingly rapid manner. And remember that I'm a geologist, so something that can happen in 3 to 5 or 10 years to me is like really, really, really fast. It took a long time to degrade the world's farmland, and I've actually come to think that we could actually restore it much more rapidly than we degraded it. And that's through the application of principles of regenerative agriculture that are up there on the screen now. The idea of minimizing the disturbance of the soil, so it's not tilling, maintaining a permanent ground cover, or growing cover crops in between cash crops to always keep living roots in the soil for reasons that will become apparent when I move on to the second half of the second phase of the talk, and maintaining diverse crop rotations, not just growing one or two crops. But maintaining 5, 6, or more crops in a rotation. That combination of minimal disturbance, always keeping something growing in the soil, and growing a diversity of plants is essentially the antithesis of what we've been teaching in modern agriculture for the last 100 years. And we've emphasized tillage, lots of synthetic agrochemicals, and specializing in one or two crops. This idea of a regenerative agriculture is a different way to look at agriculture, a different way to think about the land and think about soil in the practices of agriculture. And what can that do? Well, it can reverse soil degradation really remarkably fast. And I'm going to burn through sort of a couple quick examples here. The first one shows you the fruit of Anne's labor, because she is a major league gardener. And when we bought a house in North Seattle, it came with soil on the left-hand side of the screen, that khaki stuff up there. After 10 years of intensive composting and mulching and sort of regenerative gardening that followed those same principles of regenerative agriculture, she turned our soil into the dark stuff on the right. That's incredibly fertile. The plants are literally exploding out of the ground. Our soil is healthy. The life is returned to the yard. We wrote about that in The Hidden Half of Nature. But it's not just something that you can do in a yard. This is an example of regenerative soil building on David Brandt's ranch in Carroll, Ohio. The soil is the same. It's the Cardington clay soil for anyone who really knows the soils of Ohio. The point, though, is that color difference. Again, that khaki stuff that was what Brandt started with when he started farming, he turned it into that black stuff, and he did it with intensive agriculture that followed those principles of regenerative agriculture. Gabe Brown's ranch in North Dakota, same deal. The soil he's holding up in his right hand has more organic matter in it than the native prairie soils he started with. The soil on his left hand is his neighbor's soil. The difference, how he's been farming, following those practices of regenerative agriculture for a decade and a half at this point, if I recall. The last example I'll show you is from a no-till vegetable farm in Sebastopol, California, Singing Frogs Farm. I encourage people to look that farm up. The soil there is incredible. That's the dark soil on the right. The soil on the left is the soil from a neighboring vineyard, which has not been, does not use regenerative practices. Again, it's the same soil in terms of how you would classify it on a map. It sure doesn't look the same. One is really fertile, the other has had the lifeblood out of it. But my point with these examples is that regenerative practices can rebuild soil, the health of the soil, relatively rapidly. And what does that mean for the farmers? It means higher farmer profits. Why? Because they can achieve comparable yields by using less fertilizer, pesticide, and fossil fuel. What are the three big expenses on modern farms in North America? Well, pesticide, fertilizer, and fossil fuel. And if you can grow as much and sell as much by spending less, that's the recipe for a better profit margin. But it also, as you'll notice from all those color differences I just showed you, it increases the amount of carbon or organic matter, because organic matter is roughly 50%, more like 40%, call it roughly 50% of carbon. The darkness of those soils reflect increasing sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere in the soil. Nature invented a fine way to pull carbon from the atmosphere. It's called photosynthesis, and regenerative agriculture is a way to actually park more of that in the soil. It also would result in less off-site nitrogen pollution because we're using less fertilizers in regenerative agriculture, less synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So if we look back over the 20th century, the conventional agriculture that really evolved during that period really came to emphasize agricultural chemistry as the foundation of agricultural productivity, in part because soils were degraded and fertilizers worked to boost yields in degraded soils. But regenerative agriculture is a philosophy that uses a very different approach. It emphasizes cultivating the life in the soil, cultivating the beneficial life in the soil. And that gets us into, well, what does rebuilding soil health through revising our farming practices, what does that do for the health of our plants, the health of our crops? The second stage in this trip around the circle of soils, plants, animals, and people. Well, if you think about crops as having a diet, and many of us don't necessarily think about a plant having a diet, but they do. They take in stuff that you can consider to be their food, and how we feed our crops, the diet we present them with, can be very different if we're presenting with a fertilizer diet or what we call a soil health diet, a diet of rich organic matter, soil rich in organic matter and soil life. Crops will get different things from them. Those bars in the middle basically represent things that crops will take away. We can add a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK of conventional fertilizers up there in the top. We can grow large yields of crops by using lots of fertilizers. We know that we've run that experiment for the last 100 years. It works even on degraded land, but what does it do to the health of the crops and what's in the food that we derive from those crops is a different question. What plants that do not have a robust root systems that are developed, and if you want to run this experiment, it's easy to do in cornfields across the U.S. in terms of pulling up plants that have been relied on in fertilizer. They don't invest as much in the roots, they don't have as much of a life around their root systems, and they therefore don't pull up as many micronutrients, as many minerals, and they don't produce as many vitamins, and they lack access to healthful microbial metabolites. Where does that all come from? It comes from what Anne and I term the underground biological bazaar. If you blow up the root zone around a plant, a zone known as the rhizosphere, literally Greek for the zone around the roots of a plant, it looks something like that blow up on the right, where you have a root coming down. There's lots of bacteria and fungi that congregate around the root systems of plants. Why? Because those plants are actively pushing out compounds into the soil to feed those organisms. Those compounds are known as exudates, and they're things like sugars, they're things like proteins, they're things like fats, lipids. They're also things that the bacteria in the soil can convert into plant growth promoting hormones, because as those exudates are leaving the root systems of plants, what happens? They get eaten, they get consumed by organisms. And what does any organism do to the stuff that they consume? They metabolize it, turn it into something else, and some of those waste products from microbes that are consuming exudates around the root system of plants turn into things like plant growth promoting hormones, things that promote the health and benefit the plant, that allows the plant to capture more sunlight via photosynthesis, to build more exudates, to share them with the underground microbia. It's a positive circle. It's basically a mutually beneficial or symbiotic relationship. Fungi in the soil, in the rhizosphere, will also partner with plants. Why? Because fungi can't photosynthesize. They depend on eating decaying organic matter or compounds that plants provide them. Why would plants do that? Because fungi can actually act as root extensions and go out and actually mine mineral elements from soil particles and trade them to the plants in symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationships that actually date all the way back to the colonization of the continents by land plants some 450 million years ago. Plants and soil life evolved in partnership in ways that promote the health of both. In part by provisioning plants with mineral micronutrients. This is the periodic table up there. We've just sort of circled iron, zinc, and selenium to illustrate three important micronutrients that plants will get through partnerships with life in the soil that are essential to the health and defense of the plants, but also end up translating over into health benefits for human beings. We need micronutrients. We don't need a lot of them, but we need that little bit an awful lot. Plants will also produce what are known as phytochemicals in response to stimulation from life in the soil. Phytochemicals literally just means chemical made by plant, right? So phytochemical, it's a fairly straightforward word in that sense. But there's a dizzying array of different kinds of phytochemicals that plants make for different purposes. There's the linalool in lavender that smells so good. There's the sulforaphane in brassicas that have powerful anti-cancer effects. And the curcumin in turmeric that also has positive health benefits for humans. Those phytochemicals, though, are not made for the benefit of those who eat plants. They're made for the benefit of the plant, because the plant's making them for things like communication, how they actually integrate, how they communicate with other plants. They're essential for elements of plant defense and repelling insect herbivores or predators. And they're also for protection, things like the beta-carotene in things like beta-carotene is actually a key element in sunscreens. Why? Because it's great UV protection, which helps explain why it's in squash. This biological bazaar this interaction and exchange of materials that's happening via soil life, which you would call is affected by farming practices, that actually is really important for plants in the provisioning of their mineral micronutrients and in the building of their phytochemicals. In other words, it's part of a health plan for crops. And when we change that, when we undermine it through over-application of tillage and synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which alter soil communities of soil life, it can undercut those mutually beneficial relationships. So one of the things we did in writing What Your Food Ate was to look into the studies that have tried to compare the role of farming practices on what gets into our food. And a couple of the takeaways from previous studies we were able to identify is that organic crops tend to contain higher levels of micronutrients and consistently have higher levels of phytochemicals. And why is that? Because organic practices tend to promote soil life better than conventional practices. Rarely, though, are those studies couched in terms of measuring or assessing soil health, but we go into some of that in the book as well. And conversely, conventional crops tend to have higher levels of pesticides and heavy metals across the board. So farming practices can affect soil life. Soil life, in turn, affects what gets into plants and the health of plants, and then what then is in plant foods that come to us. And I'm going to turn it over to Anne now for the second half of this.
All right, just briefly, thank you everybody for coming inside on the solstice night when Seattleites haven't seen sun for a long time, so it's appreciated. All right, the animal part of this circular relationship. I don't think I need to say a whole lot about this slide because I think you can tell by looking at her that animals are an important part of human culture, and indeed animals have been a part of agriculture since the earliest days. And our relationship with animals, it can either be, a normal, functioning, rich, symbiotic relationship where both benefit, or it can be a disastrous kind of a train wreck. And either outcome sort of depends, in part, what kind of a lifestyle and what kind of a diet we're allowing livestock to eat. And, oops. All right. Here we go. I'm seeing something a little different on my computer screen, but I want you to see this. So, what we know about cows, sheep, and goats is that they are all a kind of an animal called a ruminant. And that word ruminant stems from a unique part of the digestive tract of these animals. And just as Dave talked about the biological bazaar around the roots of a plant, there's a similar kind of a place in our ruminants. And it's a place that's called the rumen. And I particularly like this image because it sort of says everything that you need to know about the rumen. It's a landscape, it's a place, it's an ecosystem, and it is a habitat. And it is at the very, very front end of a ruminant's digestive tract. So the first place that food drops is into the rumen. And the rumen is the heart also of a ruminant's microbiome. So this is where most of the microbial communities are living that inhabit the digestive tract of these animals. And you can basically think about it this way. When the rumen is functioning normally, the animal is healthy, and when an animal is healthy, the animal is happy. And the thing about the diet for ruminants and all of those microbes that sort of run the rumen is that the microbes do best on a diet that is living plants. And we call this the fat of the land, and it happens to have to do with the living leafy part of plants. That is the part that is photosynthesizing. And in order for photosynthesis to take place, there's a group of fats. These are called the omega-3s. We Northwesterners probably mostly associate those with salmon, but they also occur in plants and in meat and dairy products, but only if animals are eating these living leafy plants. So when we say fat of the land, we really do mean the fat of the land. Omega-3s are concentrated in the leafy material. And so I like this slide because here's some dairy cows in New England, and this is one of the first times that they're getting out to pasture in the springtime. And you can just tell by the movements that they're making that this is the right thing. This is what their bodies want. This is what their rumen needs. And they're pretty excited about hitting that pasture. Contrast that with sort of a diet and a lifestyle that is rich in another kind of fat, also happens to be a fat of the land, but these fats are concentrated in seeds. And one reason that omega-3 fats are so different from omega-6 fats is that a living leafy photosynthesizing part of a plant has an entirely different job than the seed of a plant. The seed must go on to, hit the soil and germinate and so on, and that requires a whole different set of fats. So sure, you can feed animals grains and seeds, but when the omega-3 fats drop out, and especially when the fiber of the living plants drops out of a ruminant's diet, the rumen becomes an unhealthy, diseased kind of a place. And it makes for an unhealthy, diseased animal that lives a shorter life. And it's really no way to be treating animals, and in particular, ruminants that rely so much on this upper end of their digestive tract, the rumen, where their microbiome lives. So we have been raising, as I'm sure that some of you, if not all of you, are aware, we've been raising most of our ruminants, especially cows, on a feedlot diet that's rich in grain. And it does their rumen no service, and therefore it's not much good for the animal either, other than the animals are alive and they're growing, and it puts an entirely different kind of fat into the meat and dairy products that we consume. And it's because the fat of the land, think back an omega-3 rich diet or an omega-6 rich diet, it becomes the fat of us. All right, I'm going to transition now into the people phase of things, and I'm going to carry forward some of this information about fats because it's really quite fascinating. First, however, though, I need to sort of set the stage a little bit. This is a graph on your left there. These are the COVID notwithstanding. Infectious diseases were once the scourge of humanity. It was the reason that most of us lived an early life, died early. Come around the 1950s, many of the most dreaded diseases had been brought under control by vaccines, clean drinking water, antibiotics, that sort of thing. But what was interesting to those in the field that study these things is that around the same time period, again around the 1950s, we began to see a rise in other kinds of diseases. These are on the right-hand side of the slide. These are the so-called chronic diseases, meaning that to cure, and so that once you have them, you don't really get rid of them. And there was questions about why this is happening. And much of the recent microbiome research on humans has been looking at perturbations to the microbiome as a factor in all of this, but we also know that it's likely that diet plays a role as well. But how serious of a problem are all these chronic diseases? Well, around 7 of 10 adults in the US have one or more chronic diseases, and so this is a big factor in public health and in medical care and in what it means to try and regain your health. And when it comes to fats, I want to return to here. Many of these chronic diseases tend to have some similarities. There's some kind of a disordering or a dysfunction of a normal immune response. And of course, we know through COVID that inflammation is a part of our immune response. And certain fats, and maybe you've already are figuring this out where I'm going with this, certain fats, these are our omega-6s. They're the ones that initiate and start inflammation, which is what we want if we're battling a pathogen, abnormal cell growth, healing a wound, something like that. Inflammation is a positive process when it's working normally. So this is what you want, but once that problem is handled, we need to have inflammation tone down, and back off. And that's where other fats become the compounds and molecules that are part of this orchestration of turning inflammation on and then powering it off. Those kinds of fats are the omega-3s. And in a modern Western diet, what we know these days is that sort of the ratio in the human diet of omega-3s and omega-6s has switched. Ideally, you want a ratio of about 1 or 2 omega-6 fats to about 1 omega-3 fat. What's happening with the Western diet these days is there's estimates is that there's anywhere from 20 to 30 omega-6 fats to 1 omega-3 fat. So what this tells you is that the human diet, especially in the Western world, has become flooded with omega-6 fats. This has some implications for how our immune system is responding to various things. And it sure seems like we can dial up inflammation, but it's not in a normal way, and we have trouble turning inflammation off when the problem is solved. So this is sort of how the diet of animals comes through to affect our health. So indeed, we are what our animals eat. And then I wanted to return to, these 3 things that Dave pointed out about phytochemicals: the communication, the defense, and the protection. As it turns out, we need these very things, but how phytochemicals deliver those benefits to us is quite different than how it occurs in plants. And it has to do partly with our own microbiome. Up here on this slide, there's another biological bazaar out there, and it's in our own bodies. There's more on this in The Hidden Half of Nature. It's one of my favorite topics. And the human microbiome, most of it is not sitting there in your stomach or your small intestine. It's down in, we could call it the basement, so to speak, of the human digestive tract, in the colon. And you'll see on this slide how the numbers of bacteria increase as you descend through the human digestive tract. And so what's happening here is that everything we eat eventually ends up in our colon, and our microbiome, just like that of a ruminant, tends to thrive on fiber-rich foods. So these are our whole plant foods. And interestingly, when you think about plant foods, all of these phytochemicals, polyphenols are a particularly large group, widespread through fruits and vegetables. These phytochemicals, these polyphenols, they're bound up with the fiber in a whole plant food. So what this means is that our microbiome is getting a hold of the fiber, fermenting it, metabolizing it, and they are also doing much the same with the phytochemicals that are bound up with that fiber. And what we know is that this is another case of microbial metabolites. The human microbiome is turning the phytochemicals in the human diet into other compounds and molecules. And there on the far right side of this slide, you can see all of these benefits that these microbial compounds are having in our own body. And I think this somewhat explains, you can look at the research on phytochemicals in human health, and what you'll often find is not all phytochemicals have the same, it's called biological availability, and all that means is that somehow our cells and tissues aren't able to get a hold of these phytochemicals and really do much with them. I think that probably has to do with the composition of a person's microbiome. if you have kind of a paltry microbiome, not very well nourished or fed, you've got sort of, so to speak, fewer of your inner pharmacists down there converting these phytochemicals into these other types of beneficial compounds that human cells and tissues can take up. So that's part of the story behind phytochemicals and why we want to eat a really diverse diet, and it is also why sort of the diversity of phytochemicals and the density, the abundance of phytochemicals in our plant foods. We want them high because we want to give our microbiome a lot to work with. Makes sense. All right, David had mentioned a little bit of research that we had done, and what we did is we looked at 10 farms across the US. These were paired farms, a regenerative farm compared to a conventional farm. And we're trying to look at the soil health on these paired farms assessed against the nutrient density of particular crops. And so up on this slide, what you can see, the blue boxes represent the regenerative farms, the red boxes, conventional farms. And averaged across all these farms, we see that soil organic matter and what's called a soil health score, which takes organic matter, among other factors, into account in trying to quantify soil health. And from the research that we did, both of these things were higher on the regenerative farms compared to the conventional farms. So this is telling us soil health is different. But what do those differences mean then for the crops? And this is just a summary of some of the data. There's more in the book. We also took a look at at micronutrients, both minerals, and then we've got the data on vitamins up here. But as you can see on the regenerative farms, these are average values then across the crops listed up there. And in all cases, they are higher on the identical crops grown on the regenerative farm. And so we're the first to admit this was a small sample size. This is only 10 farms, but this is the kind of research that we need out there in the agricultural world so that we can begin to better understand what are the effects of soil health on the quality of our crops, the crops that become a part of the human diet. And yeah, so just some interesting stuff there. And then another topic in the book that I want to share with you is something that's called body wisdom. When I think about those cows running off to their early spring pasture, that is one expression of body wisdom. I don't think anyone needs to understand. No one's choosing what these cows are eating. They're getting out there on the pasture and they're choosing what combinations of plants to eat in what amounts. And that is a form of body wisdom. We have it too, but it's a little harder to stay in touch with our body wisdom because, of course, we're shopping in grocery stores, we're eating out at restaurants, we're subjected to all kinds of advertising and synthetic flavors and additives and those kinds of things. But I will tell you, we too have body wisdom. And this is some information from research done on tomatoes by researchers out of Florida. And they were wondering, well, why do people like some tomatoes and not others? And so they did some work with volunteers to try and learn about, well, what are the flavor preferences? What tomatoes do people like, and what is it in those tomatoes that these people are after? And so they started with volatiles. So these are compounds that when you later this summer, when you're squishing down on a tomato, it's releasing these volatiles into your mouth. They ascend through sort of the cavernous terrain of your nose, going clear up to your brain, and your brain goes, aha, I like that flavor, and I like that flavor, and I like that flavor. There's a remarkable amount of our brains that are dedicated to interpreting and remembering flavors. And so what these researchers basically found out is that the most preferred flavors in this one kind of a tomato had the highest level of three things that are really important for human health, and that is carotenoids. These are kind of phytochemical fats. In this case, they happen to be omega-3 fats that was a part of the flavor profile here. And also some particular amino acids, and these weren't just any old amino acids. These are the so-called essential amino acids, meaning the only place they come from is foods within the human diet. Our bodies can't synthesize them. They must come from foods. So this is all about sort of how an example of human body wisdom works. And it's not at a conscious level. We're not out there sifting through tomatoes going, I need some carotenoids, some fatty acids, and some amino acids. This is a physiological, unconscious response with your gut communicating with your brain about these things. And all of this is to say that nutrient density is a big factor in our health. And all right, we've come full circle around that circle, and I wanted to highlight just a couple of other ideas and topics that we explore in the book. And one of them is this. Modern agriculture and modern farming is still sort of operating under the assumption that famine is just around the corner, and we remain obsessed with yield. And when you remain obsessed with yield, and that's the only thing or the dominant thing that you think about, these other things sort of fall to the wayside. Things like flavor, things like phytochemical density, diversity, and variety in our crops. And this isn't to say that there aren't hunger problems still in this country and around the world, but it is to say that there's a lot more to agriculture, farming, food, and animals and so on than just how much. There's our health to consider in all of this. And also, what David and I became fascinated, puzzled by, frustrated by, and have a new way of thinking about now as a result of this experience is we all need to broaden our thinking around just what is a nutrient. Because, of course, there's the classic examples, fats, carbs, and proteins. This is what fuels our growth from 2 little cells up to the biomass that we reach in young adulthood. And there's other things, though, that we really need to think about when it comes to how we farm, because how are we going to take care of all that biomass later in life? It's not by the very same things that grew that biomass. It's partly through phytochemicals. There's a handful of other compounds that recent research has shown is also responsible for sort of keeping our cells and tissues in good working order so that as we age, we're taking care of what already has been grown. And so the human body is for sure about growing from, a baby to adult, but there's a lot of our life left after adulthood, and that's where what our food ate really seems to come into play. And modern farming, unfortunately, these 3 particular kinds of things that David and I write about in the book, fats and phytochemicals and micronutrients. The micronutrients are just vitamins and minerals. These are the 3 things that too much of the time modern farming reduces their amounts or alters their profiles and composition in our food, and yet we know that they're critically important for our well-being. And so the simplest way I think that I can put this to you about what we're after and what we explored in What Your Food Ate is that it turns out that what's good for the land, for the soil, is good for us too. All right, that pretty much concludes the presentation. And apparently this talk is also going to be available, I think, around 5 days from now, according to Town Hall. So if you have friends, family who missed this or who you think might enjoy watching it, I believe it will be available and streaming on the Town Hall website in about 5 days. And of course, for those who are here in person, we're happy to sign books, not just What Your Food Ate, but the Dirt trilogy that led up to it. And so with that, I think we are ready to take questions. Thank you for your time and attention. questions from the audience, and I also believe there's some online questions out there, so that have yet to come to us. But any questions out there from you all? Two, right here in the front. Okay.
I'd like to know, some conversation about apex species, and this may be out of your line. I'm wondering if bacteria and the germs and the microbiome are the true apex species.
So the question is about apex species and whether bacteria and other microbial life are properly viewed as apex species. And that's a good question. I'm not sure I've ever thought about it quite that way before, but what I think I would probably characterize them as foundational species. So rather than viewing them as sort of the top, I'd view them as the foundation of a pyramid that supports all other life. Now, they may end up being the ultimate inheritors of the earth in the end, in which case they could end up being the apex species. But I guess it depends a bit on how one views the definition of an apex species. But I like to think about microbial life as the foundation for much of the rest of life, as sort of the essential piece upon which a lot of it rests. And we're still learning about how profound and fundamental some of those connections are, particularly with the role of soil life and plants. I mean, our understanding of that in the last couple decades has just exploded with knowledge that 100 years ago would have just been considered voodoo.
Right, yeah. I actually, for once, I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Whoa. Let's run with that.
Let's see, how about another question? Sure, in the middle there.
Yeah, so the question is, what do we expect the effects of the wildfires that have been burning across the West to be in terms of soils and soil life, and will the soil life ever recover? And I think that there's, the hotter things burn, the longer it'll take to recover. And I think there may be some very big differences in terms of what environment one is in and what the vegetation and soil life is like. But I worry personally about what we're seeing with many of the fires across the West as being, that one of the ways in which profound changes in ecosystems can be expected to manifest. And it's a bit of a digression, but years ago I was working on a site in Northern California near Pacifica, which was a gully that was cut down into some hill slope sediments. And halfway down through those sediments was a buried layer of charcoal and pine needles. Below that, it was very clear that the vegetation that had been there at that time, which it turned out to be the last ice age, 10, 12,000 years ago, was a coniferous forest. And then there was a burned layer, and above that burned layer was the modern post-glacial climate with a completely different vegetation. I really worry about whether that's happening in some places around the West today, but we're living through it as opposed to watching it in a geological deposit. Only partially answers your question, I know, but I only know part of the answer.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. Basically, the question is it possible that much like a fecal transplant that has occurred with people, with humans, could you do a similar microbiome transplant with the soil? And if so, are there any risks or problems that might be associated with that? we know that, I mean, what's interesting is that some of these regenerative practices, they're not exactly taking a collection of microbes from different soil and transplanting it. They're sort of doing a version of grow your own. And I think when you take that approach to trying to get the soil microbiome back up and on its feet, you're less likely to be bringing in things that might be problematic. Another thought on that is that if you're taking soil samples from somewhere and bringing them, say, into an agricultural setting, sometimes pests and pathogens are really particular about their own habitat. And if they're being taken from somewhere that is different, a pretty different setting than an agricultural setting, it might not be ideal for them, and they're not maybe going to be able to be causing big problems. That's a really different, that's a different sort of thing that might happen with, say, an invasive species that's like, oh, wow, all this real estate for me, I'm just going to take over and populate things. I'm sure there are folks out there in the research community, in the soil community, that are looking at this very thing, because what we've seen with plants and animals that we introduce to places, it doesn't always turn out like we thought it might. But really, really good question there.
And there's a style of farming known as Korean natural farming that I've seen practiced in Central America, where people would go out and dig in the native jungle soils, get a sample from near the bottom of the organic matter rich horizon, so there's lots of fungal hyphae in it. So they're basically trying to sample soil life. They'll then bring that back to their farm and mix that soil in with a molasses and solution. They basically brew up compost tea using that as an inoculant, and then they use that on their degraded farmland as part of a restoration process, and I've seen it work really well.
So I have a question about more about philosophy. I was listening to your lecture. It sounds like very important work. I'm wondering about the underlying philosophy that produces these kind of actions that either degrade the soil or care for the soil. So, for instance, like philosophy that sees everything as a commodity to be used as much as possible and gain as much money, or maybe older indigenous civilizations that care for their soil and had a different underlying philosophy. Can you speak to that at all, if you've noticed that at all in your studies?
Yeah, to some degree, a lot of what I wrote about in Dirt was looking at how if you treat soil as simply another input into agricultural production systems, it's going to be the least valued one. It's not a high cost, not a high valued, and what happens to the least valuable input in an industrial production process? You tend not to conserve it, you use it up. And in a way, that's what we've done with soil fertility around the world. So in terms of philosophies, one of the things that we're arguing in What Your Food Ate, and a thread that has run through our work, is looking at this thing that we need to think about the soil differently. And we need to think about the soil as an intergenerational trust, which, there's parallels in terms of indigenous thinking and philosophies in various parts of the world. But thinking about the soil as an intergenerational trust that we need to leave in as good or better condition as what we got it. And that's the heart of regenerative agriculture, it basically crystallized right there. And in a way, that means, I think, looking at promoting the life in the soil as the foundation for agriculture rather than attempting to manage, manipulate, or kill the life we don't want in the soil. And those are sort of very different philosophical approaches to how we treat the land. And when we get into thinking about sort of the lessons of past societies, we need to be careful about overly ascribing sustainability to practices that didn't actually play out that way in many cultures around the world. And I wrote about that a lot in Dirt. I think that we have the opportunity today to do is to take much of the ancient wisdom that was codified in many indigenous practices and in many soil building and conservation practices, but that were often practiced with enough disturbance that it degraded the land. It just took a long time. We have an opportunity today to, I think, marry some of that ancient wisdom of soil building with modern technology to actually make it much more sustainable over the long run. And part of that is we now know more about soil biology and ecology, and it's helping to explain why some traditional practices were so effective, and also why we may need to sort of update for large-scale production. And part of it is thinking in terms of like the style of agriculture that would clear a piece of forest, farm it intensively for a few years, and then move on to another piece of forest. That can work really well as long as you have a lot of forest to cut down and come back to. And that's not going to work sustainably over the long run in a world where we should not be cutting down native forests anymore, because we're almost out of them. So we need to think about how to adapt and use our current understanding, I think, to update much of that ancient wisdom. Much of which is still applicable, though.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is that I think all this work that we've done around soil and the farms that we visited and the farmers that we've spoken with, actually there's room for hope out there, I think, with soil. And it sort of comes down to this, you know, if you give nature half a chance, and by this I mean soil, just half a chance, and we stop hammering and chiseling away at the natural processes that are supposed to be happening in soil, it can bounce back, you know, pretty darn quick. And I think, you know, a decade ago, if you uttered the word soil health, people would look at you a little funny maybe, and you know, what are you talking about? Now, this is partly a function of the circles that we travel in. Everybody talks about soil health, but I bet that out in this audience, you know, you're hearing it more as well. And what I really like about the term, about putting health next to the word soil, is we all know for ourselves, yeah, not, you know, I'm feeling kind of unhealthy this week, or, you know, got COVID, definitely not a healthy week with that. And so we can begin to see that there's a quality of life, if you will, around soil, and that there's farmers that are, and a growing group, I would say, and this runs the gamut from conventional all the way to organic, that are really interested in the quality of life that soil has. And to me, that's a philosophy, and it's one that I'm delighted is growing, and that people like us have the opportunity to go and talk and learn from these people, and then write about it so we can, you know, spread the word on this. That was a great question. Right. Yeah.
Well, so the question is, were there any sort of big surprises, and were also any big sort of revelations in what to eat, in effect? And you know, what I thought was one of the really super cool surprises was the part that Anne was talking about at the end, in terms of the connection of flavor to what's actually in our food and how that connects to its nutritional benefits, health promoting benefits for us. And I can go a little bit more in that in a minute, but the other big surprise was just how much room there is, I think, to improve the definition of nutrient in nutritional sciences. Now, neither Anne nor I are from the nutritional science world, so we're looking into that world from the outside. But, you know, I would have thought that a nutrient was something that promoted not only the growth but the health of people. And the bias seems to be in that field that it's mostly oriented towards things that promote the growth and are essential for survival. But a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of micronutrients, that's covered under nutrients. But phytochemicals are only recently have been involved in the discussion of nutrition, in part because you can live fine without them, but you can live better with them. And so they promote health and well-being, which sort of fell a little off the table. And I was surprised by that. But that connection between the kind of flavors in whole natural foods, where the flavor hasn't been adulterated by someone trying to get you buy more of something by adding a certain flavor that may not be connected to any of the compounds that are connected to health, but that the connection between natural flavors and health-promoting compounds, that was a real eye-opener for me. It explains a lot, and it makes perfect evolutionary sense that our bodies would have evolved that way to identify. Because if you got dropped off in the middle of the jungle and you're trying to decide what to eat, it turns out that our bodies are kind of hardwired to try and select the things that might actually be good for us. So those are two that were really a big, fun surprises to me, where the sort of light went on and went, oh, maybe we're on the right track. This is all making sense.
Yeah, and I have one, and it was the beginning of this book. Of course, whenever you have an idea, you want it to be neat, and you want it to be tidy, and to stay within bounds, and to not lead you astray, and all those kinds of things. I will tell you with this book, it was leading all over the place, and it was frustrating at times because you would read, and by the way, there's 56 pages of sources here. They are available online on our website. And so we, are plowing through all of this stuff. And at times it was frustrating. This study says the opposite of that study, which says the opposite of that study, which then made it difficult to figure out what is the story here. And so I eventually came to embrace what I will just call all that variability. And I realized something about variability, whether you're talking, a dairy product, or you're talking a carrot or a cantaloupe or what have you. And then I went, I get it now. And it's really a fundamental thing. We may think that in agriculture we've domesticated absolutely, everything out of these once wild plants and animals, but we haven't. These are still living organisms. They're still subject to their environment, to their relationships with their microbiome, with pathogens, and so on. And all of this variability is there for a reason. If everything was cookie cutter and standardized, there would never be any opportunity to either take advantage of a particular nutrient in the soil. A plant maybe wouldn't be able to communicate as effectively, or maybe it's communicating more effectively because of its variability. And so the genomic variability, the microbiome variability, this is what biology is all about, because this is sort of the fodder, if you will, for evolution. This is why every single one of us in this room looks different and has a different biology. So it's frustrating to try and get your arms around that, but in the end, that's why we want variability. We don't want everything all the same, because when that fire comes, or when some other environmental condition changes, if we were all the same, we might all succumb, and then what? And so it's no different with, a cow, a carrot, or a cantaloupe. We do want variability. So that was my big aha and surprise. And then I've always been an adventurous, omnivorous eater, so I don't really think I'm eating, I'm not eating any different than I was before, I don't believe, unless I'm going to be corrected right now.
Yes, you are.
Okay, here we go.
We had not anticipated getting as far into the differences between omega-6 and omega-3 fats in the livestock diet. Ann and I are both omnivores. We eat meat, dairy, and plant foods. But we've gone now to pretty much on our meat and dairy going as wholly grass-fed as we can now that we understand just how profoundly that actually impacts the balance and mix of fats in the meat and dairy that we eat. And that was something that was just not on my radar at all when we started this book. And I've been thinking and writing about soil and food for a while now. But when you dig into that literature, and I don't necessarily recommend everybody doing that for themselves, but if you want to, as Ann said, we listed all the sources we consulted in an appendix. It's a free download on our website. You don't have to read it in the book, but you can graze it if you want, pardon the pun. But there's a lot of literature out there that we synthesized to try and look at that point, and it seems like it actually is a big deal and is a big difference. And so that changed the way we eat.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing that I became very aware of in writing Growing a Revolution, was in interviewing regenerative farmers in different parts of the world. Pretty much across the board, their costs of production were actually lower once they restored fertility to their land. It wasn't necessarily that way right out of the gate as they started to convert. But once they did, their costs of production were lower than conventional farmers growing the same things nearby. But the ones in the westernized world were able to get a premium for what they were selling, so it was more expensive. But what gave me some hope would be that if you can think in terms of the equity issue, is that if you think down the road in terms of more and more farmers adopting regenerative practices, that's going to put pressure on the price premium to come down, because right now if it's a rare commodity, it's going to be priced a little higher. Same thing with organic, actually. It's like, organic farms on average are more profitable than conventional ones. Why? Because their cost of productions is lower. Well, they basically have that same issue. It's not more expensive to grow, but they're able to sell it for more. And so if we basically are able to convert what we call conventional farming or regenerative farming today into the conventional farming of tomorrow, I expect the equity issue to somewhat solve itself.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And then how about maybe we take one more question and then we can move on to book stuff. And if anyone doesn't get their question answered, come ask it out there. Yeah, how about over there? Yeah. So the question was, how do we spread the word on this? How do we spread the word about the importance of soil, and what ideas do we have for that?
Well, and there's a couple levels. I mean, one, the group that they're from, Save Soil, is an international effort to promote the idea that humanity needs to reinvest in the health of our land and save our soil. That's a really good way to go about it, and it's helping to raise visibility and awareness around the world. There's other ways in terms of our own personal buying practices, in terms of supporting farmers who are in the regenerative agriculture space. Maybe paying a little bit more today if we can afford it to actually help that get off the ground. And so one of the things Ann and I have done are trying to, where we can, to try and learn more about the practices that farmers we're buying our food from are doing so that we can support the ones who we like what they're doing for their land. But there's also a really big issue this next year coming up in terms of the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is one of those, pieces of legislation that people in Washington State tend, in Western Washington, I would think, tend not to pay as much attention to as people in, say, Eastern Washington or Iowa or the Midwest. And yet, if we think about what shapes agriculture in this country, what's in the Farm Bill is critically important. So one of the things one can do if you're interested in advocating on behalf of regenerative practices or improving the way that farmers treat their soil is to try and get policy changes in through the Farm Bill. And so the more people who contact more of their congressional representatives and say that this is an issue that needs attention and needs support, that's also a very productive way to go about it.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, I think, is so this audience now, you know a little bit about soil health, hopefully more than when you came. And I think the way that human beings work is, we communicate and we talk and we have common language, we hope. And I think when you put the words, like I said before, soil and health together, I think most everyone, if you put that question to them, hey, have you heard anything about soil health? They would know what you meant by that question. They would know, oh, you mean soil has health? I guess I never thought about that. So part of it is just awareness raising, because for those of us who are, already steeped in these ideas, for maybe every one of us, there's 10 people out there who, oh, soil health, I guess I never thought about that. So it goes all the way from sort of, sophisticated getting involved in the Farm Bill and trying to support legislation that can boost soil health rather than incentivize practices that degrade it. And that's a whole political thing, all the way to education, because any movement or any change that comes about, it always has these, sort of common elements that revolve around getting the word out, getting politically active around that issue, building partnerships around that issue, and then, pushing the whole thing forward. So I think the time for soil health has come on that.
And I think the idea of major international investments in building soil health is a very timely idea, in the sense that it's a fundamentally an optimistic view. There's a lot that can be done, and that could be done fairly quickly and yield positive results, not only for the environment but for human health as well. And frankly, the environmental movement needs some optimism and some positive things that we can do from our individual to our collective selves. And I think the idea of organizing around building soil health as a new fundamental philosophy of farming is actually, it's a winner. I think it will win for farmers in terms of the economics, the advantages economically to farmers from rebuilding the health and fertility of their land and reducing the costs that they're paying for inputs. It helps the environment both on farms and off farms in terms of pollution. And I think given time and enough adoption, it can really help in terms of reversing some of the changes that Ann and I were writing about in terms of the human food supply in What Your Food Ate. So I think there's grounds for optimism, which is a welcome addition, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and catch us out at the book table for more questions.
Yeah, we'll be out there shortly. Thank you.